Greetings, folks. Today, I think I'd like to talk to you a bit about sound changes in early modern English. Specifically, we'll be addressing the Great Vowel Shift, which is the most important sound change in English in the last 600 years. I'll also be saying a little bit about unstressed vowels and diphthongs, and changes in consonants in early modern English from late Middle English. As for what the Great Vowel Shift was, it was a change in the pronunciation of all of the long vowels in Middle English. It had two main elements. One was a tendency toward upward movement. What that means is that the tongue's position in the mouth in the articulation of a given vowel tended to move towards either the upper front or the upper back. That's all. And it was during the Great Vowel Shift that most of the long vowels in English went from being pure vowels, that is, single sounds, to diphthongs, that is, glides, combinations of two sounds articulated in a single syllable. It seems to have begun around about 1400 and to have been mostly complete by about 1600. So basically, it began around the time of Chaucer's life, or the end of Chaucer's life, and was mostly complete by the end of Shakespeare's life, although some elements took a little longer to work out. Most likely, it was centered in London. There are a few reasons for this. One is that London, by this point, is the cultural, political, and economic center of England. Another is that being kind of a linguistic melting pot, or rather a dialectal melting pot, London was a place where change in speech tended to happen. So not only was it a very volatile speech community, but it was also a speech community that could very quickly export whatever changes happened to occur within it. If you want a quick visual, it looks something like this. The shift seems to have begun with changes in the articulation of the vowels E and U round about 1400, where these became the diphthongs I and OW. That in itself may not seem like a big deal, but the location of where these vowels are made is important. And here we need to talk about something called articulation space. The articulation space is the space in the mouth where a given sound is made. And just like, for example, real estate, some neighborhoods are nicer than others. The points at the extremes of the mouth, so the high front or the high back, for example, are what you might call prime real estate. The reason is that these are the places really of maximum clarity where vowels are concerned. Because you can't push a vowel any further than these places, these vowels made here, so E and U, for example, or at the lower end, ah and aw, are sounds that, or rather are articulation spaces that will virtually always be filled. Phonetics is no more fond of a vacuum than are power or air. What this means in turn is that once one or more of those prime locations in the articulation space is empty, other sounds will tend to gravitate toward that. Or in other words, the pronunciation of other sounds will also begin to change in fairly predictable, fairly regular ways. So if we take a look at the sounds in the front of the mouth along the left side of this slide, round about 1400, the vowel E begins to shift towards I. So the word seed becomes the word side, for example. Well, what this means is that the next vowel down the list, or the next tense vowel down the list, A, starts moving up round about 1500 towards the E space. This in turn clears that space out, so the eh vowel also moves up, and so on and so forth. Similar processes happen in the back of the mouth. In the next few slides, we'll take a look at exactly how this works with reference to specific words, so that it's a little less abstract. What I've just described for you is called a chain shift. That is, a shift that begins with one particular change, and as a consequence involves subsequent changes. So, as I said, the Great Vowel Shift begins with the diphthongization of the front vowel E to I around 1400, and a corresponding change of the back vowel, the high back vowel U, to OW, also around 1400. What this did is it left 2 of the 4 best neighborhoods in the real estate of articulation space empty, and really wanting to be filled. So in both cases, this simple change, this diphthongization of those 2 pure high tense vowels, made almost inevitable the upward movement of other vowels over the subsequent years. That is, made virtually inevitable the upward drift that would ultimately affect all of the long vowels in the English language. So if we want to track it in a more linear fashion, it goes something like this. Round about 1400, the E vowel becomes I, or rather begins its migration toward I, clearing, of course, that articulation space in the top front of the mouth. By 1500, E has drifted up into that vacated E space. That's the second link in the chain in what's going on in the front of the mouth. But that leaves the eh space open. So by 1600, the eh vowel has drifted up into the eh space, and by 1700 has gone a little further, all the way up into the e space. So we have now 2 vowels, eh and in Middle English, both converging on e by 1700. Well, okay. Down in the bottom of the mouth, stuff is also going on. Those lower front vowels, ah and ah, are also in motion. And by 1600, ah has moved through ah into that vacant eh space, and by 1700 has continued all the way through to a. So by 1700, the word fate, F-A-T-E, would be pronounced fate. And as I said, a parallel process is involved at the back of the mouth, beginning around 1400 with the vowel U becoming the diphthong ow, or, once again, beginning its migration in that direction. So the word hus becomes house. This clears the U space for the next of the long vowels further down the mouth, which is O. So by 1500, what had been pronounced O is now being pronounced U. So the Middle English word G-O-S, gos, is now being pronounced goose, that foul-tempered bird that makes funny sounds. And a flock of which, incidentally, when I was a child in Essex County, home of Hiram Walker Distillery, was used as the security system in the Hiram Walker warehouse near Bell River, Ontario. That is, every time we drove by the warehouse, there were these 3 flat buildings. I think there were 3. It's a long time since I've been there. And there was this flock of hundreds of geese just running loose inside the fence. And that was it. That was their security system. It was wonderful. Last time I went by, the geese were gone, and I guess they've gone higher tech. But quite frankly, I'd put my trust in the geese. But that was a digression, and I should probably get back on track. With that O space being cleared around 1500, the A vowel starts moving up toward the O and ultimately becomes a diphthong O by 1700. So while in 1400 I might put on my coat, by 1700 I'm putting on my coat. So if you want to see how this looks with a sort of a linguistic flowchart, let's take a look at some specific words. We'll start with the word bite. and how that would have been pronounced around 1400. Well, Chaucer would have said it beta. By sometime shortly after Chaucer's death, that word would have been pronounced bite. That is, the beginning of that diphthongization, which really doesn't come to a culmination until about 1800, I should have been clearer about that, is already in place. It's still a high front vowel, but it's broken up into two sounds. Well, by 1500, it would be pronounced bite. This is how Mallory would have said it, probably. Shakespeare, by 1600, would have pronounced it bait, whereas around 1700, Daniel Defoe would have pronounced it bite, and by 1800, William Wordsworth would pronounce it bite, as we do. Though actually he probably would have taken a little longer to say it, more like bite. Next down, we have two words that didn't used to sound the same but now do, beet and beet. Well, Chaucer would have pronounced beet the vegetable as beet, but by 1500 or thereabouts, Thomas Mallory would have pronounced it beet, as we do. And that pronunciation has been stable for about the last 500 years. On the other hand, the verb to beat, which Chaucer would have pronounced bete, has a slightly longer trajectory in its convergence with the vegetable. So in 1400, it's bete. By 1500, of course, that last vestige of the inflectional ending is gone, and the vowel has moved up a bit. So from beta, we have bet. And by 1600, again, getting around to Shakespeare's time, it would be pronounced maybe bet, maybe beat, but certainly by 1700, that beat pronunciation is established. And once you get up to that top front part of the mouth, there's really no place else you can go. This is why we have sounds converging there, by the way. Okay, well, let's move a little further down. Let's take a look at the word abate. Chaucer would have pronounced that abate, whereas Mallory, a couple of generations later, would have pronounced it abat, and Shakespeare would have pronounced it abet, while Defoe, of course, would have pronounced it abet. This is very similar to what we say, but not exactly there, is it? Abet is still a pure vowel, but by 1800, Wordsworth, for example, would have pronounced it abate, just as we do. Now, let's move to the back of the mouth. We'll start with the high back vowel oo, as in hoose, the place where you live. Well, by 1400 or shortly thereafter, it's begun to split into a diphthong, hoose, rather than hoose, hoose. It's very similar to hoose, but you can hear the difference, can't you? By 1500, this is pronounced something like hose, and by 1600, Shakespeare's time, house. By Defoe's time, at the beginning of the 18th century, you will find now that you are living in a house, which is how Canadians pronounce that anyways. And by 1800, you'll be taking a little longer to say it, you'll find you're living in a house. Now, with that oo space clear, let's take a look at the word for boot, that thing you put on your feet, which Chaucer would have pronounced boat. Well, by 1500, it's become the word we say now, boot, and it hasn't changed since then. So there's a similar pattern of drift and subsequent stability in the back of the mouth to what we see in the front of the mouth. These things really are working in parallel. They're following the same mechanisms. Similarly, for that thing you take a sea journey in, a boat, Chaucer would have gone sailing in a boat. Mallory, Shakespeare, and Defoe would have all gone sailing in a boat. And by 1800, Wordsworth and you would find yourself sailing in a boat. So that's pretty much how the Great Vowel Shift tracks up to about 1800. Okay, folks, future Roger here. I realized as I was getting toward the end of my recording session that this and the next few slides were recorded with my microphone actually unplugged. I'm not quite sure how that happened. So the sound is actually going into the built-in microphone in my computer, and the sound quality is terrible. but as I want to get this to you at something like a reasonable time, like today, I think it's better if I just post it sounding as dubious as it does, rather than record a huge chunk of the lecture over again. So, apologies for the quality in the sound on the next few slides. If you want to look at this in a slightly different but very similar way, we can just track the development of a handful of words that we've had at least since the Middle English period. For example, driven or drive, which in Chaucer's time would have been pronounced drive, by Mallory's time drive, by Shakespeare's time drive, by Defoe's time drive, and by Wordsworth's time, just as we do, drive. House we've already done. Feet takes the same course as beat the vegetable. So Chaucer would have said fete, whereas by Mallory's time, feet is simply the stable pronunciation for the last 500 years. Same with fool, which Chaucer would have pronounced foal, and which everyone since Mallory would have pronounced fool. On the other hand, there's the young horse, fall, which by Defoe's time in the early 18th century would have been foal, and is currently pronounced foal. That is, it begins with a neutral vowel and glides towards an oo. Take, Chaucer would have pronounced taka, Mallory tack, Shakespeare take, Defoe take, and everyone since about Wordsworth take. We also have a couple of diphthongs in here. The thing that propels a sailboat, of course, we would call a sail. Chaucer would have called it a sail, Mallory a sail, Shakespeare a sail, Defoe a sail, and Wordsworth and subsequently a sail. Similar progress for law. Chaucer's lawyer in the Canterbury Tales studies law. Mallory in his reading, I'm sure, covered some law. Shakespeare has a number of characters who specialize in law, and we, of course, have several universities dedicated to law. And that, more or less, is the Great Vowel Shift. Now I think we'll move on to talk about a few other sound things, and then call it a day. Also, by the way, as you've noticed, I'm using the International Phonetic Alphabet a lot today. I will be doing this increasingly as the course moves on and we start speaking about different dialects of modern English. I find that a visual representation of these is sometimes actually more effective than merely an auditory representation. So, if you haven't done so already, do try to familiarize yourself with the IPA. It is given in the appendix in your textbook. We should also probably say a little bit about the unstressed vowels and diphthongs, most of which tended to be reduced in value, not always, not in every case, but most of the time. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. You may remember a few talks ago that I mentioned unstressed vowels receiving less distinct pronunciation than stressed vowels, and this being one of the reasons that contributed, or one of the factors that contributed to our loss of inflectional endings after the shifting of stress in the Germanic languages from the second to the first syllable, and thus de-emphasizing those inflectional endings. Here's another consequence. Modern English really only has 3 unstressed vowels, and these have very little to do with spelling. These vowels are, and you can follow along with the IPA symbols on the slide, e, and a. Of course, is the neutral vowel. It's just with the mouth slack and the tongue not really doing anything, just hanging out in the middle of the mouth. It's pretty much a dead center vowel. That is, it's the mouth's resting position. So if we take a look at the words I've given you on the slide here, open, introduce, kingdom, breakfast, the unstressed vowels there are all pronounced pretty much the same. Any difference between them is largely a function of my dialect, which I'm consciously trying to control for. While in Middle English these might have had a fuller pronunciation than we give them, by the time we get to the modern English period, spelling in unstressed vowels is becoming decreasingly important. Similarly, we have for I, which is the high front lax vowel, breakfast, bounty, and likely. That is, those terminal Ys, when they're not stressed, tend not to be given the full value of E, but tend to drift more towards I, simply because we're not putting the stress on them. Stress naturally tenses the mouth. So stressing something will naturally push it towards a tense vowel position rather than a lax vowel position. The other one is an open mid-low back vowel, as in grandma. Similarly, with the vowels that come before R in unstressed syllables, it often doesn't really matter what those vowels are either. They just tend to be pronounced in general American or general North American English. So fur, and conifer, that fur element is pronounced exactly the same, regardless of spelling. And even if we shift to one of the non-rhotic dialects, like received pronunciation in Britain, non-rhotic means you don't pronounce your R's. We might have f, and conifer. Either way, they're still pronounced the same. We also have what's called a zero value. That is, nothing there at all, which can be represented simply by an apostrophe, as we do in many of our contractions. For example, can't rather than cannot, didn't rather than did not. Similarly, rather than saying mutton, we probably say mutton. There's no vowel there at all. We go directly from a not quite fully articulated T to the N. Now, in many dialects, we also might do the same thing with breakfast. So rather than breakfast or breakfast, it'd simply be breakfast. And as I said, this is why I'm trying to control for my own dialect. I tend to go toward the middle one, the breakfast one. So this is kind of creeping in when I try to say breakfast, breakfast, breakfast. I can hear a difference myself, but I'm not quite sure that you can. So we basically have three ways of pronouncing breakfast, all of which ignore the spelling of the word breakfast. We can pronounce it with or nothing at all. We see a similar pattern with unstressed diphthongs. Regardless of spelling, when a diphthong is unstressed in modern English, it tends to just be O or A. So, window, Monday. And between these and the unstressed vowels I mentioned on the last slide, that's pretty much the full range of unstressed vowel or vowely things that modern English has, at least in its standard dialects. There are variations, of course, when you move away from the standard dialects into the non-standard ones, but we'll talk about those in due time. As for why exactly the reduction in the phonetic values of all of our vowel sounds may have happened, the short version is, we don't know. The slightly longer version of we don't know is, here's an idea of what may have happened. As I mentioned just a moment ago, with the loss of the inflectional endings beginning in late Old English and really coming to a conclusion by the end of Middle English, pretty much every English word became shorter. This may not sound like much, but it's probably important. And as we talked about, the terminal E, which for much of Middle English was just the fossilized remnant of that old system of inflections, just pronounced unstressed neutral vowel, doing no grammatical work whatsoever, is gone completely by the beginning of the early modern English period. What this means is that if the final syllable of the remaining word is unstressed, the mouth, which would already be relaxed in the position, can begin relaxing a little earlier because, of course, unstressed syllables are naturally more relaxed than stressed syllables. What this means is that vanished fossil remnant of the old English inflectional system, though no longer there, is still in a sense acting almost like a center of gravity, or maybe even a source of entropy, where the pronunciation of other terminal unstressed vowels are concerned. And of course, because we tend, even unconsciously, to do much of our speech and much of our grammar by analogy. That pattern that may have crept in during that transition from the late middle to the early modern English periods might simply have been generalized to the other unstressed vowels. This is all speculative, but there's nothing about it that doesn't track with the ways people actually speak, the ways that speech patterns have actually been studied and analyzed. And this brings us around to consonants. We'll start with the new consonants in English because there actually are a couple. One, symbolized in the IPA by the letter y, is zh. In Middle English, there is no zh. So the word that we pronounced vision, Chaucer, without changing the spelling, would have pronounced vision. Fusion would in Middle English have been pronounced fusion. And garage, if it actually had existed in Middle English, would have been pronounced garage. The reason behind this particular change is probably that this sound corresponds to a sound in French. And of course, as you know, English continued well into the modern English period to import many of its words from French. Another addition occurs in the consonant which we spell ng. So, for example, the last sound in our words thing and song. The change here is that for Chaucer, again without changing spelling, these words would have been pronounced thing and song. That is, that G is articulated at the end, whereas in modern English it's simply dropped, basically because it has no phonemic value. It still survives as an allophone, that is an alternate pronunciation in some dialects. I've heard a number of people, particularly from various regions in northern England, who would still say thing, song. But the difference between the two is not phonemic. It means nothing. It's simply a variant pronunciation.
Regular recording quality resumes here. But we didn't just gain consonants, we also cut a lot out, and we cut out much more than we gained. One thing we lost was the vocalization of the GH when it follows a vowel. Licht, as Chaucer would have said, we now say light. And rather than saying thocht, as Chaucer would have said, we now say thought. As for why this happened, again, we don't know exactly, but there's a possibility that this may have followed on the diphthongization of a number of vowels. That is, it may also be associated with the Great Vowel Shift. How this works, basically, is that the mouth position in the diphthong is different than it is in the pure vowel. It's also already in motion, and it may simply be easier to glide directly to the next consonant rather than having that fricative either forward or back in the mouth. You can try that yourself if you want. So we've got licht and light, but leicht actually seems to take more effort to say. So this makes intuitive sense, but you can only base so much on intuitive sense. So like I said, this is a tentative hypothesis at best. Another loss is the initial consonant in clusters with nasals or Rs, that is, nasal vowels or Rs. For example, while Chaucer would pronounce the word Knight, knicht, we pronounce it night. While Chaucer would pronounce Know, kno, we say no. Similarly, we gnaw something, while Chaucer would gnaw on it. We write things down, while Chaucer would urita. We writhe in agony, while Chaucer would urida. And always when a consonant in a cluster is lost, it simply means it's no longer needed for comprehension. It's no longer needed for understanding. It's really just as simple as that. Sometimes this, of course, can lead to confusion. For example, now night and knight are pronounced the same way, but these are very rarely confused in context. Also with consonant clusters, we lost the voiced B when it follows an M. So, while we would say Mary had a little lamb, Chaucer might say Mary had a little lamb. Similarly, while for us, a tree might have a limb, or we might find ourselves out on a limb, Chaucer would find himself out on a limb. And while we comb our hair, Chaucer would comb, his. And this brings us pretty much to the end of the pronunciation changes in early modern English. So, just as a matter of summing up the sound differences between Middle and Modern English, I thought I'd do something that may seem a little odd. I'm going to read you the first few lines of Chaucer's first major poem, The Book of the Duchess, which he completed around 1358, 1360, something like that. And then I'm going to read the whole thing again, just with modern English pronunciation and dropping in the odd modern English word where the Middle English is unclear. But that won't need to be done very often. And I think you'll be able to note just by this how much that simple change in pronunciation, mostly the Great Vowel Shift, makes medieval English feel distant from modern English, even though by the late Middle English period it really isn't in anything other than pronunciation. So, here's Chaucer in his own language. I have great wonder by this licht, who that I live, for die ne nicht, I may not sleepe well nicht nocht. I have so many an idle thought, poorly for default of sleep, that, be me truth, I tak no cape of nothing, who it cometh or goeth. Ne meanest nothing laugh nor loath. All is illiche good to me. Joy or sorrow, whereso it be, for I have feeling in nothing, but, as it were, a mazed thing, all way in point to fall adown, for sorrowful imagination is alway wholly in me mind. Now, we'll try that again in modern English with a very few tweaks in vocabulary. I have great wonder by this light, how that I live, for, day or night, I cannot sleep well nigh at all. I have so many an idle thought, purely for default of sleep, that, by my truth, I take no account of anything, how it comes or goes. To me is nothing loved or loathed. All is alike good to me, joy or sorrow, wheresoever it be, for I have feeling in nothing, but, as it were, a mazed thing, always on the point of falling down, for sorrowful imagination is always wholly in my mind. And by the way, if you are ever looking for a poetic description of the state of chronic depression and the exhaustion associated with it, you'll have a hard time doing better than Chaucer. So, as always, thank you for your attention and your time. I do look forward to speaking with you on Friday. And for those of you who haven't been attending the tutorial sessions, please feel free to join us. I would certainly love to see you and hear what you have to say and address any questions that you may have directly. But if you don't, in any case, I do hope everybody is finding these little talks useful and interesting. Thanks very much. I'll talk soon. Bye for now.